Welcome to Session 9, Parenting in Plantation Capitalism.
How you doing today, Haley?
I'm doing good.
That's a beautiful teacup you've got there.
Thank you. It's my plantation capitalism teacup.
Well, tea and plantations.
It goes together. It's from the
And it
British
goes
Empire. Yes.
getting back to your British roots.
It is. Yeah, it literally is. It says it on the bottom. It says Royal Albert.
There's no lead in that, is there?
Oh, there might be. I don't know.
Oh
Hopefully
gosh.
not. Hopefully not. It doesn't. It is number one in a series, and it's probably fine.
Okay. I mean, the plantation system.
I know. Could be lead in anything. I'll put it away.
So today we're kind of jumping into practical topics, and we thought we would start with the experience of parenting. We have our own personal experiences with our own families, but we're going to try to talk more broadly about how do people in the U.S. experience plantation capitalism as parents.
Right. And we want to talk about who are the plantation owners and what is a plantation in this system as we think about parenting.
Yeah, I think there's like two primary contexts that we want to highlight. Um, we've been saying the plantation capitalism system is one where elites exploit people and the planet, and so what's probably top of mind for many of us is the COVID pandemic, right? Like
Mhm.
that was what we would call the fast pandemic,
Mhm.
and yet there was also a slow pandemic underneath it that it revealed, that it shone light
Mhm.
on. So
Mhm.
the fast pandemic, the COVID pandemic, I think was just brutal
Mhm.
to people in general, and especially to parents,
Yes.
because many of us were told that we were, quote, essential, but then our
Mhm.
very bosses were willing to kill us, right? Like, just come into work. Who cares about masks? Who cares about like
Right.
social distancing? And
Right.
so it included teachers, nurses, caregiving workers, grocery store clerks, farm workers, food
Yeah,
packaging people, service workers, mail
exactly.
delivery,
Right.
and this is before we knew much about the virus. And so I think we felt like the issue is safety, and not
Mhm.
just pay, although pay is a factor, but safety on the job. It follows us home, like in an infectious disease, this could get to our families. So it would affect our families. And, we didn't know very much about how it could affect kids. Later, we find out, okay, it's more uh, deadly towards the elderly than towards children. But
Mhm.
it's not like we knew that up front.
Right. And I can remember during that time, we had just come out of personally a place from my husband working in one of those essential jobs, really being on the front line. And we had this sense of like, wow, we've really dodged a bullet because he would have had to have been facing people all day long. And there was not a lot of great quality masks out at that time. And people sort of remember, like, oh, we were so deeply locked down. But like, let's be real. No, we weren't. You still could get food in the United States. Food was still being packaged. You could still get medicine. You could still go out and, order some food delivery from a restaurant. People were doing that work during that time.
Right.
So if you were fortunate enough to have a job where you could work from home or you could, buffer yourself from being in contact with people, it feels like you didn't it wasn't affecting you as much. But we need to remember that there were people who were in food packing plants and factories who were still actually producing the things that we needed to live our daily life at home.
That's right, and that is just so sobering that it was easy to not think about them,
Yeah.
at least for some, or it
Yeah.
certainly seemed that way. And so that COVID was the fast pandemic, and it
Hmm.
highlights in with brutal disregard just how much our plantation capitalism system would sacrifice children, right? Would sacrifice families and our well-being and our capacity to care for children, and to efficiency, I guess. So,
Right.
and it also revealed some underlying things, what others have called the slow pandemic or slow
Mhm.
pandemics, health issues that interacted with COVID that made it more deadly for some people.
Right.
So people with pre-existing conditions, obesity, or asthma, all of which are related somewhat to like where you live, how good the food and nutrition is that you are able to access and pay for. So it showed that our health issues have been increasing and our mental health issues have been increasing. The level of anxiety, isolation, and loneliness that we've
Mm.
felt, it was just increased more and more during COVID.
Right. Well, also, as health issues have been increasing, wages have been going down.
Right.
Reagan cut the legs out from under some unions, made it legal for companies to buy back stocks. Wages weren't really going up. Thankfully, that's something that's sort of reversing now. There's a lot more support for unionization. The UAW's just done a really great job. I think the Writers Guild has done a great job negotiating with those big studios. So we can check in on our old friend Jim Cramer and see how he's doing with the whole UAW strike. And I want to, always like check in on his health because, have Jim Cramer's health issues been increasing as union support has been going up is a question that we're all wondering about. But that's not great that wages have been going down, that we've needed to reach this point of feeling so hopeless
Right.
that we need more worker solidarity against, again, the plantation owners, the capitalists who are lining their pockets with record corporate profits and not allowing that to come down to the people who are actually doing the work. That is a slow pandemic.
Right. I remember this was the season when Jeff Bezos built a rocket that was shaped like a penis, flew to outer space, and then he came back in a cowboy hat and held a meeting and said, I want to thank all of you and Amazon customers who made this possible. And I think that was a slip, but it was very true. Record profits in the COVID, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and a billionaire flies out to space.
That's beyond tone deaf.
Yeah.
There's no word for how tone deaf that is.
And then you back up a little bit, like another decade or so, and you get to the rising cost of housing, childcare, college, healthcare, and a lot of it is tied to, or at least some of it is tied to, the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And
Mm-hmm.
when
Mm-hmm.
when the cost of housing was already growing faster than wages, way outpacing it, and the government was willing to bail out banks but not people, right? And
Right.
so it bailed out the predators and not the victims of those predators. And when
Right.
the Federal Reserve just printed all this money to bail out the banks, and it created asset bubbles in the real estate market, and to some degree the stock market, and also cryptocurrency. But
Mm-hmm.
housing prices affected the most people.
Right.
And when we step back even further, it's just devastating. My parents bought a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom house in Cerritos, California for $36,000 in 1974. Right, $36,000. And
That's
and now
very
it's
little.
valued around 1 million if I look at Redfin and whatever.
Right. Right.
And what's most important is, like, back in the 70s, renting or paying a mortgage was probably about 30% of one income.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the coast especially, it's about 40 to 50% of two incomes.
Right. And
That's insane.
I can remember in sort of 2005, 2006 time reading, I was basically in the time of life where one buys their first house and reading, you should only spend 30% of your income on the cost of housing. And I did the math on pretty much every single house around us and realized that it would take so much of our income to buy a house. And I thought, who is buying these houses? And so we did buy a house, and then of course the market dropped, and it was the great financial crisis, which no one was calling it that at the time when the financial crisis was happening. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, I made such a mistake, I shouldn't have done this. This was a bad thing that I did. And then years later I'm doing research just on for business stuff and realize, oh, this crashed the entire world economy. So me at 25 years old buying my first house was really not to blame for something that scholars and economists years later were writing about the great financial crisis that crashed the whole entire world economy. But it made it really hard to have a life where we could have children and afford, childcare and all those things. It really trickled down into the daily stuff of life when people were playing by printing a lot of money and bailing out the banks, as you said. It's a mess, and the impact is felt by the people who live their day-to-day lives by going to work, making money, and trying to take care of their kids, not by these massive corporate bank faceless, nameless capitalists,
That's
plantation
right.
owners.
Who gave their own executives more bonuses, but then parents who were probably, especially young parents, who might have been able to take a job elsewhere, suddenly stuck with a mortgage that was underwater, and like you can't even move to take the job you want.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, it wiped out, especially for Black and brown families, just a lot of wealth, right? Because it disproportionately affected them. But also there are regional differences, and this is really interesting. So there was a Politico article by Colin Woodward called "America's Surprising Partisan Divide on Life Expectancy," and I want to read a paragraph from that. He says, "Step back and look at a map of life expectancy across the country, and the geographic patterns are as dramatic as they are obvious. If you live pretty much anywhere in the contiguous US, you can expect to live more than 78 years, unless you're in the Deep South or the sprawling region I call Greater Appalachia, a region that stretches from southwestern Pennsylvania to the Ozarks and the hill country of Texas. Those two regions, which include all or parts of 16 deep red states, and the majority of the House Republican caucus, have a life expectancy of 77, more than 4.5 years lower than on the blue-leaning Pacific coastal plain. In the smaller, redder regional culture of New France in southern Louisiana, the gap is just short of 6 years. So large are the regional gaps that the poorest set of counties in predominantly blue Yankee Northeast actually have higher life expectancies than the wealthiest ones in the Deep South. At a population level, a difference of 5 years is like the gap separating the US from decidedly unwealthy Mongolia, Belarus, or Libya, and 6 years gets you to impoverished El Salvador and Egypt. That's just that points to things that we have been calling out, right, in our video series.
Right. And I think that that's really important to emphasize this again. So the poorest blue counties overall have higher life expectancies than the wealthiest ones in the reddest parts of the United States.
There's a sense of you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and then if you are a parent, if you have young kids, then you do it for your family, because there's no help coming to you,
Right.
as opposed to living in a culture where there's a policy difference that says, let's invest in our children, let's invest in people.
Right. And what that means is that we don't have a culture generally that would say, I live in a place where it's fine, and one day I'm going to get old. Hopefully I get old and I live long enough. And when I am that old, I would like for there to be doctors to take care of me when I'm old. And I would like those doctors not also to be old. I would like to have younger people who are not sick who can take care of me. That's just how having people take care of you works. And so therefore, I would like to see that we invest as a society in the public good, which means that we need people, all of the people, to the best of their ability, to be invested in so that they can do the most good for all of us together. And so instead of being like, oh, well, you didn't make it, just pull yourselves up, we could say, no, I'd like to put in some time and some money to invest as a public. So when I'm old, the health infrastructure exists so that I can have longer life expectancy, so that there's healthy food for me, so that there's all of the things that I need to be able to live when I'm old, and even when I'm younger and I have children. That's a good, sound way to think about public good, public investment.
That's right, especially when we learn that early childhood experiences affect
Hmm.
so many things, like
Right.
your physical health, when you're an adult, your mental health, your need to take anxiety medication, your all these things.
Hmm. Hmm. And I think that it's important to recognize that it's hard for people to take care of their children when they're working, they're poor, they're stressed out, they're
Yeah.
tired, they can't think. So there's this January 2019 report by the Council for a Strong America, and they say that, quote, the majority of American parents with very young children are now in the workforce. This is true of both single and married parents. And of the 14 million parents with children under the age of 3, 11 million, 78% are working. So, lest everybody raise their hands to do another, hey, millennials are super entitled. Let me be clear about this. This report was a bipartisan coalition of over 2,000 executives. So we need to recognize this for what it is. Even capitalism's ruling class are getting a little bit worried that their workers aren't going to be able to get any work done because they're all working and worried about their kids. It's reaching a tipping point now.
Well, don't they want people to be panicked about like providing for their kids? Doesn't that make people better workers?
It doesn't make me a better worker.
Weren't you telling me about a book that you had read that expressed the we're done with blaming ourselves for, all the problems that we're facing?
Yeah, yeah, I loved it. This is Anne Helen Peterson. She wrote the book Can't Even. I just love the last part of this. She said, millennials have been denigrated and mischaracterized, blamed for systems that set us up to fail. But if we have the endurance and aptitude and wherewithal to work ourselves this deeply into the ground, we also have the strength to fight. We have little savings and less stability. Our anger is barely contained. We are a pile of ashes smoldering, a bad memory of our best selves. Underestimate us at your own peril. We have so little left to lose. I know that a lot of parents today feel like that. We have hardly anything left to lose. We are trying our best to raise our kids. And I'm a therapist. I work with parents. Everyone is doing such great work, using so much strength to be incredible parents for their children. And it is very hard to do. Earlier, people genuinely had it easier. In 1960s, men were earning 400% more than their fathers were at the same age. That's not
Wow.
true today. 400% more than their fathers were at the same age.
Yeah, that would give people a different sense of confidence and
Right. A sense of like, well, if you're not making it, you must be doing better than us now financially. And so why can't you make it? Just have more kids. It's not really working that way. We're isolated. We've gone through recession after recession.
right. Haley, you're a bit younger than me.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
do you feel like as a older millennial, you feel like Gen Xers like me and boomers above me, like kind of look down on you as a parent, and
Yeah.
how so?
Well, I can remember when my kids were younger, not toddlers, but maybe toddlers in preschool, and I was looking for mentoring by older women at the church, and I really sought out these relationships, and everyone seemed kind of puzzled why I would want someone to mentor. Don't know how to make sense of that, but that's what it was. And the vibe was sort of like, why do you need this? Why can't you just figure it out on your own? And I just persisted in asking. And so I was matched up with this older woman who she came to my house several times while I was, chasing my toddler preschoolers around. And I said something like, oh, it's hard to grocery shop with two little ones. And I was just doing my best to manage. Um, and she responded in a way that I'll never forget. And she said this kind of condescendingly. It was like, well, when my kids were little, I just hired a babysitter whenever I needed to go shopping. And I was very floored by the ease that she just sort of threw this one out at me, sort of cluelessly, as if every single time I needed to leave the house and go to the store, I could just hire a babysitter. I don't know how I would get that. Am I supposed to go on one of the nanny baby apps and get a babysitter. I know all of the Facebook groups and all these nanny apps are just jammed with people like desperate for childcare because they have to go to work. Who's going to do this? Random neighbors? I can't afford this. How can
Right.
I
So
explain to a babysitter that I'm paying them rather than taking two very well behaved but normal little girls for a simple shopping trip? So she couldn't really understand my life, and I couldn't really understand hers, but she was much wealthier than me. So that might have been a piece of it there.
yeah, I mean, somehow I have this picture of you could hire, I don't know, a teenage girl that you know in your neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
And but today's childcare is more complex. There's
Yeah.
more professional standards and higher pay for it. You know,
Yes.
and
Very
probably
much
rightly
so.
so.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And it has gotten more expensive over time in the United States. Like these numbers do shake out. In 1960, childcare made up 2% of total family expenses. But in 2013, it made up 18% of total family expenses. That's almost 20% of your budget goes to
Wow.
childcare. That's
Wow.
very different.
Yeah. Well, how and how does that compare with other things like healthcare?
Healthcare, in contrast, since you're asking, has doubled as a share of spending, and that's extremely not good. But
Wow.
okay, maybe healthcare's gotten better. Maybe we're getting what we pay for. Maybe, right? But I have to emphasize this: childcare and education spending has grown ninefold. Ninefold.
Wow. I mean, no
Mm-hmm.
wonder we're all going into debt. We're just swimming in
Yeah.
consumer debt.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, single parents are going to spend more on their kids as a share of their paycheck. So about 1/3 of their income is spent on kids versus a quarter of a two parents family income that goes to child related expenses. So this is just terrible icing on a terrible cake. Single parents, they make less to begin with. Working mothers today spend as much time with their children as stay-at-home mothers did in the 1970s.
Why
Right.
can't we get more help as parents? Like,
Right. Right. And I was reading Elliot Haspel's book about childcare and increasing tax credits. And he does touch on this. He touches on the concept that early childhood brain development is a critical period of life that you never get back. And the government actually used to send out like child rearing advice things to people that said, babies need rest, so don't pick them up. Just leave them there and let them rest. And it was like, you don't pick them up if they cry, essentially. And then they were like, oh, well, that was really bad. Like, you should probably pick up babies if they cry and talk to them and play with them and stuff. And so they were like, oops. And then they changed, which is really terrifying that happened. So now we're like, okay, so we need to take care of babies and pick them up if they cry.
yeah,
So we're trying to do that. And ideally, we're giving people the flexibility to be able to stay home with their children if they choose to do so. And if we have, as we said before, most parents are in the workforce, most two-parent households have both of them in the workforce, then we need to find a way to help parents to be able to adequately and in a jubilee way take care of their children out of a state of abundance, from an abundance mindset, not like a poverty mindset.
yes, because our state of mind and heart
Mm-hmm.
uh, are things that our babies can pick up. Uh,
Yeah.
Haley, you told me about coming back home after delivering your first child by
Mm-hmm.
C-section and then
Mm-hmm. I
working
worked that
immediately.
same day. Yes, I worked that same day. I had a student who they needed to have a lesson. They needed help. And so
You're a
I was
music
like,
teacher,
I was
right?
a
Like,
music teacher. I'm still a music teacher. And I was like, well, I really do need the money. And so the day that I brought my first daughter home from the hospital, I worked that day because I needed the money. And I'm actually not alone in that. Nearly a quarter of employed mothers of newborns are back at work 2 weeks after giving birth. And Elliot Haspel says, like, we should feel ashamed of ourselves that's our society, that women are back at work 2 weeks after giving birth. That is not enough time.
So I'm looking at this graph at
Mhm.
it comes from the New York Times from
Okay.
2021, and it says how much government spend on childcare for toddlers. And I am even more ashamed.
Mhm. Norway, $29,726. The United States, $500.
$500?
Yeah. Iceland, 24,000. Finland, 23,000. Denmark, 23,000. Germany, 18,000. And it's, for our right-wing friends out there who don't like the idea of like government spending money on childcare for toddlers. They're spending my money on children that aren't my children. Again, let me point you back to your end of life care. Would you like doctors and nurses who were loved and cherished as children and who have that sense of humanity and grew with great developed brains and went to medical school and learned how to take care of you, people who became great engineers and engineered great products for you to use and roads that you can drive on and cars that are safe? Don't you want that? Because we have to spend the money on it, and parents alone cannot afford to spend the money on early childhood care for toddlers and newborns.
Well, and it's also to say we want to invest in women who have invested in themselves,
Mm,
and if they want to get back into the workforce, then let's help them do that, right?
right.
And so it's also kind of it feels like such a slap in the face for the
Mm,
US to be at the bottom of this list and spending
mhm,
$500, really helping or not helping families, especially women,
mhm,
to find the help they need. And this is in the middle of COVID.
mm.
This is 2021.
Right, right.
Another chart from The Economist in July of 2021, again showing which countries have the most generous childcare policies. I think this list has 41 countries on it. The US is at the bottom next to Slovakia.
Hmm. There have been lots of people who have posted these lovely baby boxes that they get after their baby's born. There was a recent one, I think, that was going around on social media where the person showed the cardboard box and the onesies that they got and the socks and the breast pads, and it had a little mattress in it, mittens, nail files, breast pumps, all sorts of things that frankly, it costs a lot of money, even little things like that everybody gets one of these, no matter who you are, is a lovely, lovely gesture. And I know that our right wing friends are like, that's socialism. And I'm like, you know what? I don't care. This is a nice gesture of public good that we can help out our fellow man with.
Right, right. Well, I know we'll get into this later, but I think we used to depend on living close to grandma and grandpa, right? Like
Mm,
living for parents to live close to their parents and
mm-hmm,
rely on their help. So there is a lot of unseen help that kind of doesn't register on the
right.
GDP scale, right? Like
Mm,
it's not formal, it's not part of the formal economy, it's part of the informal economy.
right. And it's certainly not pure bootstraps.
Yeah. Yeah.
It never has been. It never will be.
I know you don't like that guy, that CEO with the long hair, Dan Price, who
Oh, yeah, no, I don't like him. I forgot if he's a villain still or what, but probably.
when he gave his workers higher pay, they had
Hmm.
more children.
Right.
They got married.
Yeah.
I mean, it
Yeah.
was really interesting.
Yes, and that goes to show that all of the old boomers who are like, "Oh, you kids today, you won't get married and you won't have kids," and all the kids who are millennials in their 30s and 40s are like, "Can we have enough money so we could get married and maybe have a baby?" And they're like, "No, have them anyway." And it's not good fiscal policy to deny people the adequate means of living and then also demand that they produce babies for you. It really has a strong plantation vibe to it in the way that we've been talking about it throughout this series.
Right. This is where, oh gosh, even tying it back to the topic of abortion, right? Like,
Mhm.
uh, men propose to their girlfriends at lower rates in the Rust Belt, right?
Mm,
When jobs moved overseas, it made men feel like, I don't know if I have enough money to support a family.
right.
So, from a kind of moral standpoint, does that mean that people are having sex at lower rates? Probably not.
Right.
but they're getting married at lower rates.
Right, because they don't feel like that they can combine their households and start their life and, settle down because you've taken away the means for them to feel financially secure and that they can provide for themselves. That's a very reasonable decision to make in the face of like economic decline.
Right. So these programs that we've just highlighted, like government spending on childcare for toddlers, it's been shown that there could be a few different goals behind that. One
Mhm.
is increasing fertility, which as an aging society, like that's a concern. Like
Right,
who is going to care for
right,
the elderly?
right.
Another goal is increasing women's labor force participation. In
Mhm.
Europe, it shows this really helps women get back into the labor force. And then the third is that ensuring children of all backgrounds are equally prepared. It says rich families can more easily afford high quality care, which contributes to achievement gaps as early as kindergarten. I mean,
Right.
yeah, we observe that based on the number of words that children are exposed to within the first 4 years of life.
Mhm.
Research in the US shows that children are less likely to have formal childcare if their parents are low earners, Hispanic, or aren't college students. Universal programs have been shown to shrink the gap in kindergarten readiness. Yet, in the US, 1 in 3 American children start kindergarten without any preschool at all.
Right. Right. And so I think it's important to, again, if we're thinking about public good, if we're thinking about bringing Christian principles into the public square in a fair way, then we ought to have the idea that we would like for children of all backgrounds to have adequate preparation for learning, because that's what's right to do for humanity. It is not fair if rich families can pay for expensive preschools and other families have two wage earners in the household and their children are suffering as a result because they don't have the
Right,
input of adults speaking to them and helping their brains to develop. It
right,
means that we as a society are failing a number of people.
right. It means that kids are getting raised by the television.
That's
So
right.
that those are just really important things for especially our audience as Americans to think about. Like,
Mhm.
what who suffers as a result of the every individual go at themselves, every family go at themselves. What it means to
Mm.
be family friendly, in effect, has been like not families benefiting across the board, but just family values as if it just values themselves keep families together, as if values themselves raise children. No, actually, people who have margin, who have time, money, healthy emotional lives, they
Mhm.
raise children. So,
Right. Exactly.
so what are some U.S. attitudes towards government subsidized childcare? Because I think we're saying this has to be one of the things we look at more.
Right. I hate government subsidized words. I hate the words government
Yeah,
subsidized. I like to think of it as public investment,
yeah,
community investment in childcare because it invests in the future for everybody. But some people like to say government subsidized and then as if it has like horns behind the words.
that's very true.
Mhm.
Yeah, I guess at some point we'll talk about the tax code.
Mm-hmm. So there are some people who are real mad about childcare.
Yeah, I think the idea that I don't want to pay for I don't want to help support your kids. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really what's behind it.
Right.
Um, I mean, how else can we explain the fact that the US allowed the child tax credit to lapse? Like during
Mhm,
COVID, we expanded the child tax credit. We what slashed the number of children in poverty by a half,
mhm.
and then we let that expire.
Right, right. Well, it does remind me of our video about abortion where you said that people would rather the laws make it illegal if we had more abortions than if it could the law would make it legal, but we'd have fewer. They're like, I think I'd rather have more laws and more death, please. And it's this is the same sort of thing where we did a thing that helped children measurably. And
Hmm.
then we were like, no, let's stop that. And then
Yeah.
children went into poverty, and we were like, that's right. Now we're keeping our money.
There's another study here that comes from 2021. The American Action Forum shows that programs that invest in child welfare really help boost outcomes of health, education, even marital rates, right? So this article called Child Poverty and the Effects of Anti-Poverty Programs. We'll put that up there and put up the links later. But that is really important. Often these public investment programs, they may not benefit the parents generation, but they really benefit the children being
Right.
raised by those parents, because those parents have greater peace of mind, or the kids are given the opportunity to be in more academically stimulating environments.
I always think about these objections to any sort of policy, fiscal policy that makes it so that people aren't earning their keep, if you will. So children can't work, or they ought not to work because they are children. Their job is to go to school and learn and grow and become workers later on. And I was a little bit, I like to say I was a little bit adopted. I was not adopted at all, but I did have legal guardians at one point, and they were very right wing. And I mean, at one point, I think I was talking about something about children, and surely everybody from both sides of the aisle, and this was in the 1990s, so things have changed a bit since then, but we're all trying to find ways to make it so we can have a nice society, so we can live together, so we can, help children. And they were kind of, not down with that. And then I was like, well, I mean, it does take a village to raise a child. And the amount of like immediate, like, I can't believe you said that. How could you say that? How could you quote Hillary Clinton book? That was immediately sort of like this cacophony of like, you liberal at me, surprised me. And what I couldn't say at the time, but I certainly will say now, is like, I'm the child and you are the village. You are actually actively taking care of me right now. I was in need as a child. You stepped in, and others too, as the village, to help me. And you can't see that this is some sort of, it's almost like a weird reverse hypocrisy to not realize that you did the very thing that you're saying is a bad thing to do for society. We all benefit when we help each other as a society, when we step in and do for other people what they can't do for themselves, and help them to gain autonomy and agency in their lives. Ugh.
That is that is really ironic. That
Mhm,
Well, I feel like a lot of folks, including some conservatives, are kind of facing a reckoning on that. David Brooks had an
mm,
article called "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake,"
mhm,
and it was in the Atlantic in 2020. This caught our interest because he says something. He gives kind of a historical overview, and he says the nuclear family of 1950 to 1965 was this historical anomaly, and if you were white, you were heavily subsidized so that you could
mhm,
do that,
mhm.
right? So, so the nuclear family is as much a constructed ideology that's funded by the government than anything else. But he steps back and he says, he quotes another book. He says, in his book Tribe, Sebastian Junger describes how while European settlers kept defecting to go with Native American families. So this is in colonial times.
Oh, wait. White European settlers
Yeah,
were defecting from their people to go live with the people already here. Why?
Well, because there was a greater sense of community, because people wanted to live in a village, as you put it,
Mm,
right? And the European family structure was just too lonely
mm,
and isolating,
mhm,
especially because
mhm.
you lived just in this nuclear family and in this big house on a big plantation, and you were,
Right.
I mean, how far would you have to go to visit a friend?
Right. Right. And that is a very lonely existence. That actually sounds really terrible. I would never want that.
Yeah. So he says almost no Native Americans ever defected to go live with European families.
Of course not. Of course they didn't.
Right. And then whenever European Americans captured Native Americans and like forced them to come live with them or near them, they taught them English, taught them Western ways of dress, but almost every time they're able, the indigenous people fled. They went, we don't like this.
They were like, this is terrible.
This is terrible. And so, but the opposite happened. Like European settlers were sometimes captured by Native Americans during wars, and then they somehow wind up living near Native American communities, and they rarely tried to run away. And that
Oh,
this
oops. Oh, oops. They didn't try to run away. Why is that?
exactly. And all this talk about, well, we have the superior civilization, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
as shown by what? Do people vote with their feet? I think so.
I think they do. I think that's a market working. I think that's like free market family capitalism when people choose to leave their European plantations and go live
But
in
see, they
community.
didn't build a wall, Haley. If they had built a
Oh,
wall, then
mm,
we would
mm-hmm,
have none of that. None of that.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So David Brooks refers to this and says early on there were these indicators, right, that were troubling
mm,
about the kind of this nuclear family. If but it really got pushed hard again in 1950 to 1965. You
mm-hmm.
had government subsidies that made U.S. manufacturing work, right? I mean, we were leading the world in these kinds of jobs, but we
It
also
sounds like you're saying it's socialism for white people.
socialism for white people. Yeah, Chris Ladd
Yeah.
has called it white socialism. Not that
Yeah.
every white person benefited from this, so
Right.
that
Right.
we can yeah accept that criticism,
Mm-hmm.
but it certainly was
It's
true
not
that
bootstraps. Whatever it is, it's
exactly
not bootstraps.
it was big government, right? Like
Yes.
it was the tax code saying let's make your mortgage interest deduction tax deductible, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
let's subsidize your loan so that you can go buy a house in the suburbs. It was
Mm-hmm.
big government action. Let's make roads easily accessible so that
Yeah.
everyone can buy a car.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we've constructed the society that, yeah, I mean, it kind of leans towards or depends on the nuclear family in the sense of like a suburban housing policy, pro
Mm-hmm.
automobile, anti public transportation, the way our tax policy is, our corporate policy. It's also quite, or it has been quite racist and classist in its desire to isolate the poor into certain ghettos. And so he says, we've made life freer for individuals and more unstable for families. The upshot of it is this: it's come back to bite us. We've
Mm-hmm.
made life better for adults, but worse for children. We've moved from big, interconnected, and extended families, which help protect the most vulnerable people in society from the shocks of life, to smaller, detached nuclear families, a married couple and their children, which give the most privileged people in society room to maximize their talents and expand their options. The shift from bigger and interconnected extended families to smaller and detached nuclear families ultimately led to a familial system that liberates the rich and ravages the working class and the poor.
Mm. Well, this leads into some of Elliot Haskell's book and some of his policy suggestions, where he does address this and says, when we have a bunch of individual people, um, what has worked previously is these extensions of, human connected networks. And so it's rarely tenable to say, okay, we're going to set up, a childcare center and everybody can take their kids there, which is why he advocates for tax credits for just money in people's pockets, because then you can decide you are going to hire the neighbor to come over and do something. You can decide that you're going to do a more formal childcare thing. You can do a nanny share. You can pay grandma. You could get grandma to do some child development learning so she could do a much better job and, not turn the TV on or something. These are ways that society can support people where they still have their agency intact. They can still raise their children as they choose to raise their children, but we are supporting them. It's a nice way to try and get people more connected, so it's not just little bubbles of nuclear families isolated.
So how do you feel about the Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, saying, what do I owe other people's children? Because I know we're getting into what does Jesus's Jubilee economy mean? He benefited from a lot of public investment, right? In him and just in general. So we could name things like vaccines, health research, roads and bridges, probably bank bailouts that helped his stock portfolio. Like we keep voting against, our reps, our Congress people and senators from insider trading. Like he probably benefits from that.
He probably benefits by driving down the road and having the traffic lights work so he doesn't get into a head-on collision. I bet he benefits from drinking clean water out of the water fountain in Congress, and he feels good because it doesn't have poison in it. And he knows that it doesn't have poison in it because we publicly fund things like infrastructure, and he can feel good about that. I bet that's nice. He benefits from that just like I do. What does he owe other people's children? He owes everything to other people's children because he benefits from society just like I do.
And Jesus said, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks.
Right.
I mean, that statement really shows it all. What do I owe other people's children? Yeah, I mean, all the things you benefited from, and people you care about, they benefited from that. He was one of those who wanted to let the child tax credit expire, even though it lifted millions of children out of poverty. It's not actually that expensive of a program. You could tax Jeff Bezos alone and make up that difference.
Right. Just for the well-being of children,
of 35 million families.
Right.
So as we think about Jesus's Jubilee economy, in earlier videos of this series, we talked about how both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, we see how God loved on children and how Jesus loved on children, right? So Leviticus 25, God loves on children. He says, all the Israelites, you're all my kids. I'm going to gift you a good land, your portion of the inheritance. Every 50 years, I push this reset button. So because you're all my kids, like I want to give you an inheritance. You might have your own kids, but you don't get to pass down all of the advantages or the disadvantages that you possibly can because you're all my kids. And then Jesus also affirms that he wants good things for children. It's really striking, I think, in Matthew 19, Mark 10, and Luke 18. Every time Jesus welcomes children, that little story is put next to the rich young ruler story because this is about how Jesus is building a community where people share, people are generous, people invest in one another and invest in their relational bonds. That being the backdrop of what we're saying, I think we would say the Jubilee points us to the fact that we need spaces, we need time, we need resources, and we can dream then about pushing back on the plantation capitalism system for the sake of healthier children, for investing ourselves in these children and allowing the community to invest as well.
What's interesting to me, Mako, especially when I visited Boston, was that there are so many triple-decker houses, even new ones being built, and that doesn't exist here. I mean, we have townhouses and we have apartments and condos, but that sort of small scale density was something that I haven't seen in many other parts of the country. So I think you can talk to us about these spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, the multifamily house was zoned out in most communities because it was stigmatized. I mean, at
Mm,
one point, the stereotype was deliberately circulated like, oh, these multifamily houses, they're just like roach infested units that
mm,
poor immigrant families live in. You don't want to be one of those. And we don't
right.
want those in our neighborhood because it'll invite the quote unquote riffraff. So, in an article in the Anti Racism Daily, the author
Oh,
says this: there were also insidious reasons for this shift rooted in racism and classism. From the 1890s through the 1920s, there was a concerted effort to minimize multi generational living for certain groups of people. And it talks about how in New England, these triple deckers had already been built. And they were attractive, right, to lower income and working class people. But in 1894, a group of Harvard graduates, thanks
mm,
a lot, Harvard, created
mm-hmm,
the Immigration Restriction League to advertise the dangers of immigrants, quote unquote. As
mm,
part of their campaign, they made three-decker homes a symbol of immigrants and decried them as unsafe, which quickly influenced the public and the policies. In 1917, the Providence Community of Commerce stated that other peoples were realizing it lowers one's social standing to be rated as a three-decker dweller. By 1927, nearly every state in New England had established rules and regulations to make it virtually impossible to build a triple decker.
mm,
And yet, I can't tell you how thankful I am to live in a triple decker. It is
mm-hmm,
amazing.
mm-hmm.
So sad. And I do notice that a lot of cities are regretting the fact that they only zone for single family homes, that they didn't
Yeah.
even think about duplexes. And
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I think about just being younger parents and having we at one point we had lots of people who were in our life, people who were doing ministry alongside them with and it was very helpful to have people sort of in and out of our house. They weren't right next to us, but they were around us a lot. And so I think that being in close proximity to people who you care about is really important. And so you've written about, or you have some info here about this website, Co-Abode.
yeah, yeah. Because it's especially helpful for folks who are just vulnerable to things, whether they're a single mother or an elderly person. Like living with other folks in other generations can be really helpful. So co-abode is a co-housing project in which groups of adults live as members of an extended family. And this quote comes from David Brooks in his article, "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake." It says
Mhm,
you could live in a place which is designed for co-housing, right? So of course there are separate bedrooms and shared communal areas because
mhm,
that's kind of a smart use of space. And so
mhm,
there's a real estate development company called Common that launched in 2015 and operates more than 25 co-housing communities where young singles can live this way. Common also recently teamed up with another developer to launch Kin, a co-housing community for young parents. And I was really intrigued by this description. Each young family has its own living quarters, but the facilities also have shared play spaces, childcare spaces and services, and family-oriented events and outings. And one
mhm.
community in Oakland, California, called Temescal Commons. There's 23 members. They range in age from age 1 to 83. They
Wow.
live in 9 housing units. And so this was intriguing because it's not some rich Bay Area hipster commune. The apartments are small. The residents are working and middle class. They have a shared courtyard. They share this industrial sized kitchen. Residents prepare a communal dinner on Thursday and Sundays. Upkeep is a shared responsibility. The adults babysit one another's children. Members borrow sugar and milk and other things. The older parents counsel the younger ones. When members of this extended family have suffered bouts of unemployment or major health crises, the whole clan has rallied together. So
Mm,
it's a clan, right? It not by blood,
mhm, mhm.
but by shared values. And
Yeah.
that's really powerful. Um,
This really makes me think of how people will say that the reason why Americans love college so much is just because they live close to people who they like, and everything's walkable and convenient, and you can get food easily, and you're just living in community. And then when you leave college, you're in this lonely apartment and you just have to grab food on the way home and you just watch Netflix. And I mean, it does sound nice to be, and I have lived in this way where you're around people all the time and you get to choose when to have your own privacy. It's lovely.
Right.
But
And
you
yet
do
there's
have to be in a society. You have to like give and take. You have to live in a way
right,
that you're in peace and harmony and friction sometimes with people.
right. Well, and there's a kind of stigma. I mean, I
Mhm.
think my, my parents did not understand why I enjoy living this way. They felt like it
Mhm.
was a continuation of college.
Mhm.
And but
Mhm.
in reality, I think it takes more emotional maturity to live this way. Takes more conflict resolution skills, takes
Yeah.
more willingness to flex,
Yeah.
right? It actually I, it takes less emotional maturity to live by yourself. And so I think,
Mhm. Mhm.
or kind of in more isolated situations, because I
Yes.
think we purchase our independence from God and our
Mhm.
need to depend on Jesus
Right.
by living separately. So
Right.
so that's, space. We could also just mention that social housing, the way Germany and Austria and other countries do it, where they build very affordable units for working class and middle income people, has worked really, really well. Um, there's they have buildings that are public, green, they're subsidized, including for young families who often really enjoy living in the city, right? Even
Mhm.
though later
Mhm.
they may choose to live elsewhere, um, just just to grow as a family or something.
Mhm.
But early city, but living in the city and living up with other young families is pretty attractive. And I
Mhm.
remember seeing a video that said that interviewed some people who said like, yeah, I paid 10% of my income to live here. That's insane. We need space in order to
Mhm.
live more creatively together. And we
Mhm.
also need time
Right.
to rest and time to invest in relationship, because
Right.
the people who benefit most from exhausted workers are, of course, they're like bosses, stockholders,
Mhm.
people who
Yeah.
don't really want workers to have a lot of options, who don't want them to
Mhm.
strike.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I would say both major political parties and the corporate media also benefit from having exhausted workers, because then people don't have time to become informed citizens, right?
Right.
I think we've been talking occasionally about the 4-day work week and that idea,
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
just for people to have more time to enjoy nature, take
Yeah.
walks, date,
Right.
know
Right.
themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, and be informed. That would be so important.
Mhm. Well, that's something that Elliot Haspel actually talks about, that parents who are parenting and are tired and their kids are little, they have very little time for civic engagement.
Hmm.
And being able to, as a society, be able to give parents the breathing room so that they can engage in a civic way so that it will benefit their children, because they have a vested interest in ensuring that the continuation of society is working for absolutely everybody, that would pay off for
Right,
everybody.
right.
We need the time, and we need the ability to engage. And it shouldn't just be sort of the stereotype of an older person who's retired and they have nothing better to do than to write letters to the editor and show up at every town hall meeting. Everybody should be engaged.
Right. We should be taking our children to neighborhood meetings. We should be taking
Absolutely.
them to zoning discussions, right?
Right.
Like,
Right. It's their world.
yes, absolutely. We should be spending more time in parent-teacher meetings about how the community can rally together and, use the spaces at the
Hmm.
schools.
Right.
I just wanted to read this article from Alternet because it talks about how we almost had a society like this. Like back in 1933, we almost passed a labor bill for the 30-hour work week. 30 hours.
No. No, why didn't we?
Well, here's the sad facts. The April 15th, 1933 issue of Newsweek, one of the first in the magazine's history, contains a remarkable cover headline: Bill cutting work week to 30 hours startles the nation. Only 9
Mm.
days later, on April 6th, the Black-Connery bill, that's what it was called as it was moving through Congress, had passed in the US Senate by a wide margin.
Mm.
The bill fixed the official American work week at 5 days and 30 hours, with severe penalties for imposing overtime work. Can you imagine? Like, you know how stressful
No.
it is to go to the post office on a weekday
Yeah. Right. Right.
or to go to motor vehicles? Like, you almost
Yeah.
have to like ask for a whole day off. But
Yeah. Or to go to the dentist or to, go get some antibiotics because you have a strep throat or something. You have
right,
to stop everything.
right.
Hmm.
Well, but I guess FDR buckled under pressure from the National Manufacturers Association, and
Ugh.
the House of Representatives didn't pass it because he
Mm.
didn't, galvanize the
Mm.
energy and focus to it.
Hmm.
We could have had more time.
We would
Time
have.
is such an important part of Jubilee. And finally, we need resources, just as in the same now in there's a way in which, of course, it's easy in the Old Testament to see God providing for all his kids, right? Like he owns the land, he makes the land fruitful. We
Yeah.
have to, we can't just apply that or claim that today, but
Hmm.
we do have to think through how do we share the resources we have in common.
Right.
Matthew Desmond, in his book Poverty by America, has this basically summarizes it by saying, we can do it. Poverty is a policy choice, but we can change those policies. And the
Hmm.
answer is get the rich off welfare and government assistance. And it's like,
Oh,
ooh, ooh,
get
right,
the rich off welfare and get the rich off the government assistance. Yes.
right. So he points out all these things about like how we think of public housing as the poor, uh, dilapidated buildings that are kind of like the projects, but we
Yeah.
don't think of public housing as all the the mortgage deduction subsidies that we give through the tax code, which that is
Hmm.
public housing.
Yes.
And
Yes, it is. It is publicly funded housing. We just play a little mind game with it.
he points out over the last 50 years, personal incomes in the US have increased by 317%, and
Mm.
yet federal revenue has increased by only 252%.
Hmm.
Personal fortunes have outpaced the public purse, slowly choking public investments. So I know,
Yes.
there's a lot of people who want to defund the IRS, which is
Mm.
just the most ridiculous thing. Like
Hmm.
if if the if the billionaire class just paid their fair share in taxes, like what's legally required, we would
Hmm.
make billions more.
Hmm.
Another, thing is stop corporations from making us fight amongst ourselves, right?
Hmm.
Like I think Biden has succeeded in passing a 15% international corporate tax rate. So there's a
Hmm.
level playing field among countries, right? Like
Hmm.
big corporations can't pit one country against each other,
Hmm.
but we do allow states, we do allow that inside the US. So
Hmm.
Intel just got, I used to work for Intel, so I follow them. So Intel just got $2 billion in tax subsidies from Ohio, right? Because they're building a fab, they're building a manufacturing plant there, and they need a new, totally different water system. Ohio says,
Hmm.
like, we'll build it for you, and
Mm.
you'll get all these tax benefits. But 2 billion? I mean,
Yeah.
I think in 2021 or 2022, they were profitable they had 20 billion in profits. So
Hmm.
they get to save 2 billion? Like,
Hmm.
think about how many teachers and nurses could use that support.
Right.
What
Right.
if what if we passed a federal law that said corporations cannot pit one state against each other and fight for
Right.
basically a bribe, right? Like,
Right.
give me a lower tax rate.
Yeah.
And
It's giving what Amazon did with their new corporate headquarters, where there was all that. Where will it go? And they ended up doing it in Arlington, and they're just going to rename Crystal City to something that I'm not going to remember. I'm going to call it Crystal City forever. But they were just going to, turn it into like, Amazon's National Landing, I think they were going to call it because it's near the airport. And I will never call it that because and it's wrong because everyone had to play this game of like, please, Amazon, come here. We won't charge you anything. And It shouldn't be that way. Amazon will be using the resources, as in, again, the roads and the water and the electricity, everything that comes from everybody going to work at this Amazon headquarters. It costs money. They should pay money.
While we're talking about taxes, I got to mention Dorothy Brown, The Whiteness of Wealth. She's a tax
Mhm.
lawyer, and she says we should stop subsidizing the white middle class married single income family.
Mm.
That is,
I think you have to say a little bit more about that because people might be mad.
well, the quick summary is that white families get a tax subsidy for investing in their kids, college tuition, like
Mhm.
saving
Mm.
for that. But
Mhm.
Black families often have to pay for their elders,
Yeah.
right? But that's not tax deductible. Or,
Mm. Mhm.
if you have a dual income earning family that makes what, $100,000 total,
Mhm.
uh, you actually are paying more because you're paying for childcare so that you can have the dual income, right? But if
Right.
you have, a husband who makes $100,000 and a wife who is a full-time stay-at-home mom,
Mhm.
they get to keep more of their take-home income. So the
Mhm.
whole system is designed around the white middle class married single income family.
Right.
And
Exactly.
there are hidden costs in our tax code that keep people at a disadvantage the further you are away from that.
Right. Good points.
How's that for a summary?
It was great. Thank you.
Okay, great. And then the last thing, right? We have to think about the needs of lower income families.
Mhm.
Um, I think colleges and universities are kind of falling out of favor these days because
Mhm.
people wonder, is it a good return for our investment? Um,
Mhm.
a fair question. Uh, but in other European countries, they invest more in unions, in the trades, and make it more affordable and more attractive for people to go into those kinds of jobs. Um, we've talked about wage multiples, right? Like the CEO and the janitor making a wage multiple. Like
Right.
that would be fair. We could do things like that. SNAP benefits has been really good for local economies. Each dollar in federally funded SNAP benefits generates $1.79 in economic activity. It lifted 4.6 million people out of poverty 2015, and children in families receiving SNAP were significantly more likely to be classified as well than young children whose families were eligible but did not receive SNAP or did not apply or things like that, because there's a, people feel like there's a stigma, so they don't want to do it.
Right. Right.
So, those are some important aspects of how to apply Jubilee principles of space, time, and resources
Mhm.
to help parents in a plantation capitalism system.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. But join us next time for session 10, Marketing, Plantation Propaganda.
So you should be having more kids,
Mhm.
even though
Mhm.
you can't afford it. I mean,
Mhm. Mhm.